And then we're going to kind of go into science for a little while. We're going to look at extremophiles, because they're interesting little organisms and what we can learn from them. Then I want to talk about what makes a crisis kind of extreme, and then how do we manage it? What does this mean for us in terms of communicating during a crisis? Because it really does change the dynamic more so than we originally had thought, at least when we're kind of looking at in the research part of it. But starting at the beginning, and that's an optimal response, because that's the key. That as crisis communicators, you're doing a lot of other stuff with crisis. You're doing management, you're doing preparation. There's a lot of other things going on behind the scenes people never see. But during a crisis, that's when communication comes front and center. And so you need to think about what is your optimal response. And that's a response that can maximize the benefits to your stakeholders and to your organization. And when we're talking about maximizing benefits to the stakeholders, what we're talking about is their safety. You're protecting them in some way. And organizations sometimes err on not putting them first and not thinking so much about their safety. A good example of that is actually the recalls of food products. Many times companies do very little than the minimum in the US to tell people about that there's a problem with a product and it needs to be recalled. The reason they do the minimum in communication is because they know the more people who know about the recall, the bigger hit it could take on its stock prices if it's publicly held. So they're making some trade-offs there. But I want to argue that you really want to maximize that for your stakeholders to really be perceived as being effective in your communication. And from the organization side, you have things you need to protect. You need to protect your market share. You want people to keep buying your product. You want to keep operating. You want to kind of keep making money along the way. So there are some outcomes that we need to consider for maximizing it. And what this does is essentially when you can optimize your response, you shorten the crisis clock. And you can think about this, when a crisis hits, there's a certain period in time in which you're really going to suffer damage. Now, sometimes a crisis lingers, but we're not talking about like minor effects, but when it really impacts you as an organization. So you're thinking about this is the height of when you have the recall. This is when people are seeing flames coming up from when there's been an industrial accident at your facility. So you're impacted very quickly. Well, how do we come back from that? Well, the optimal response will move us back more quickly as opposed to a suboptimal response, which we're going to talk a little bit about that as well today. So you want to try and shorten that clock. We want to take as little damage as possible. And a big part of that is helping the stakeholders. That helps to reduce the damage. Because when the stakeholders are happy, they're not being upset, they're not going on social media, they're not talking to traditional news media and extending the crisis damage for you and creating more of a problem, right? So there's a true benefit in putting the kind of the victims and the stakeholders first. And I like to use situational crisis communication theory as my way kind of looking at how to optimize the response. In part because I created the theory, but we've tested it and it holds up pretty well. And today I'm going to talk about when it doesn't hold up pretty well as part of that, when it doesn't work. And essentially what you do in an optimal response is build around crisis responsibility. And the idea as an organization is that you can anticipate, depending upon the type of crisis you're in, how much responsibility stakeholders are going to say you have for that crisis. Sometimes it's a natural disaster, so you don't have that much. It's not really that much of your fault. But other times, it's really wholly your fault. You made really poor choices. You knew it was a risky choice. It went bad. Think about BP in the Gulf of Mexico. They knew it was risky. They went ahead anyway. Huge failure. Well, that's going to kind of come back to them. And we talk about an ethical-based response, and that's the one that focuses on the stakeholders. In an ethical-based response, your first statement needs to be, tell people what they need to do to protect themselves physically. Don't eat a product. Throw away that food. Take your car in for a repair. Did any of you have any of the airbag recalls? Yeah, that was fun. I get a note from my dealership. Call us. You have a bad airbag. So I called them and like, oh yeah, we can get you that. We can fix that in about 3 months. Oh, okay. So for the next 3 months, I'm just driving around, and maybe that airbag, if it goes off, could kill me. But that's okay. All right. Yeah, but they warned me. They told me. I wanted to tell them, do you know you just increased your liability by telling me that? Because now, if I'm injured and you knew it and you didn't fix it, I could sue you. But in the end, it was all fine. But that's what we need to do. You need to tell people what I need to do to protect myself physically. Then you also help them cope psychologically. And a very important part of that is to explain what you're doing to prevent a repeat of the crisis. We sometimes call this corrective action, but I think a better term is a curative action, because you're trying to cure some of the problems that existed within your system. Think about this. Are any of you like really keen to think, I really want to go fly on that Boeing 7, that Boeing Max, or you really want to go out on that plane right now? Because they kind of seem to know what's wrong, and then they don't seem to know what's wrong, and because there's always something new, and this has been going on for over a year. Every time I turn around, there's a Boeing's like, well, maybe it's this new thing. It's like, okay, that's a lot of confidence, but that's part of it, because that's what creates the anxiety. Because one of the things that crises do is they induce anxiety, and the researchers at Georgia have shown this. And part of that is, I got to know that's not going to happen again, or at least you're trying to prevent it from happening again. That's why you have all that stuff on products. It's called tamper-resistant packaging. Not originally, as Johnson & Johnson called it, tamper-proofing, because as they found out when they had a second product tampering incident, it doesn't guarantee you can't tamper with it. It just reduces the likelihood that it will. And so that's kind of the framework we're coming from, kind of with SCCT, has saying, oh, in this situation, here are some optimal responses. So these things should work. And it also tells you which things to avoid as well. But let's kind of shift over and go into the realm of science for a while. Sometimes I like to think of things that are like analogous, and maybe there could be some insights from that we could then apply to what we're doing in the communication field. So our friends in science have some interesting ideas. They don't always relate to communication, but we can kind of see how they might come over. And that's why I want to talk about the extremophiles here. And as Chase mentioned in the introduction, these extremophiles, they're organisms that have the ability to thrive. And that's the key. They thrive in extreme environments that are out there. So they not only survive, but they thrive. And I want to kind of play with that difference as we get closer to talking about its application to organizations. So they've developed these unique mechanisms and these molecular means to cope with these extreme environmental conditions. And so what do we mean by extreme? Well, there's actually a lot of different types of extremes that you're going to find extremophiles in. They can survive radiation. They can survive high acid. They can survive in high alkaline environments. They can survive in high heat. They can survive in very low temperatures. So these are the types of organisms that you find living in around vents in the ocean where there's a lot of heat coming out, or in other areas. And they can live in very high saline environments. And you can add to that pressure. Many of them can live under extreme forms of pressure. And in fact, one we're going to talk about can actually survive in outer space on its own. We wouldn't. You put a human up there and take them out of a spacesuit, and it's if you've seen science fiction films, it gets ugly fast, because you really do kind of blow up. Right. And here's the tardigrade. The tardigrade might be the most famous of all extremophiles because, as we'll see in a minute, it's gotten a lot of airtime. Right? These are very tiny microorganisms, and you might be familiar with them if you've seen them on video. They have been in The Family Guy. They have been in Star Trek Discovery, and that's the only time you've seen like giant tardigrades. They had a giant tardigrade in Star Trek Discovery because that's a person, and the tardigrade is bigger than an individual. And they also had them on South Park. So the tardigrades get a lot of playtime. So they've been out there, and people talk about them. But they're a good example of how do extremophiles survive, because we can look at the tardigrade and kind of what the tardigrade does to survive. And again, we're going to start by surviving, and then we'll move to thriving. Here's an example. There are two options that a tardigrade has when it wants to survive. One is that it can curl up into a protective shape called a ton. So it just curls up. Right? So if you were to take it into space and put it in the vacuum of space, that's what it would do. And they've done this. In the vacuum of space, it's a ton. You bring it back, give it time, it comes back to life. Right? So it's a fairly unique ability. And they've even frozen them for I think some they froze for over a decade and brought them back because they go in this protective shape. Do that. Another option they have is they form a bubbly cyst around their bodies, and that helps to protect them from the extreme conditions that they're experiencing. But if we start thinking about this, well, how does this relate if we think about organizations, all right? And the organizations trying to survive in an extreme situation. All right, well, they do. You have organizations who have the circle of the wagons mentality, and this comes out of old Western movies where they come under attack and they circle the wagons and you just try to protect yourself. That's very defensive. And that's a case where your legal team is probably leading the effort. Because they're going to say, don't talk, all right? Because the legal team doesn't want you to talk much, and the communication people want you to talk, and they sometimes conflict over that. But if you have a good legal department, that's not a problem. So that's one option that you have. Another option is you go silent, you stop communicating. And that had been common advice given to companies. You're in a crisis, stop communicating. Particularly if you're running reputational advertising, pull back on that. In today's social media environment, that's not really an option anymore. You can't run silent, because are you suddenly going to turn off all your feeds and not post? That seems odd. But you also can't run your feeds as you regularly should, because that's odd as well. Although you'll see many organizations do that. There's a big disconnect between the social media division and what the crisis team is doing. They should be united during a crisis situation and work more together. Both of these are suboptimal. They extend the crisis clock, because you're just letting time. And eventually people will forget, and we can go back to doing what we did before. And if you're a solid company before the crisis, the odds are that's going to work for you. You're going to survive. And again, if you're a large-sized company, you're fairly likely to survive a crisis. These guys. And we've seen lots of examples of that. Toyota survived. BP survived. BP can survive a lot of fun. During the financial crisis, all the kinds of banks in the U.S. survived for that, because you can get by. But that's not thriving. That's just surviving. So if we want to think about more, what else helps the extremophile survive? What did they do? What's unique about them that allows them to survive that we could think differently? And it would better help us in communication. And as we start going to more of a DNA level, we're kind of looking at what's going on here. And this is what they have been doing in the sciences, that in the sciences they've been going in and looking more closely at extremophiles. And in particular, what they're looking at are enzymes, which they call extremozymes. As these organisms, they produce these extremozymes, which allows them to survive. So if you're an organism that survives in a high saline environment or a high heat environment, it's the enzymes you're producing that allows you to survive and to thrive in that environment. So that's different than a tardigrade. You've stuck them out in space, and the tardigrade turns into a ball, and then when they get oxygen again, they come back. This is different. This is just, you exist every day, and you thrive through this. So they're in very, very difficult environments. And what they've done is they've actually started using this in industrial chemical processes and to create medications. They've been looking at these extremozymes for it. I'm not real clear on all the technical details on this, because I don't make pharmaceuticals and I'm an industrial chemist. But the key is the enzymes are maintained during the extreme processing conditions. So that allows humans to process under extreme conditions such as pressure or other conditions and keep things intact through using these extremozymes from these extremophiles. And this can include, again, temperature, pressure, salinity, and all three of these can be used differently in the process. For what and why, I don't know. All right? It just is, all right? as a part of it. So then we need to think, well, for organizations, what are the conditions forcing them to become extremophiles during crisis? So what do I really mean by this? What do I mean by extreme crises? And that's kind of the starting point, because, yeah, we know there's a lot of routine crises, and it's hard to put a number on it, but let's say 70% of your crises are probably in the routine category. The knowledge we have will work, and you should be fine. Does that mean companies always do it and do it well? No, they still make mistakes for various reasons. And what are the extremozymes that allow these organizations to survive? And so these are the two driving questions that I want to talk about as we move from the tardigrades to actually what we might do in organizations and what that might teach us about communication. Because a tardigrade itself is not much of a communicator, but it can give us a few lessons along the way. And this becomes a challenge, how to conceptualize extreme crises. This is actually something I have been interested in for a very long time, and probably 20 years, and it's taken that long to find a good conceptualization of it. Because what you have here is you have to have something that's actually measurable. All right, we've got to be able to measure it here if we're going to test it. It's got to be viable too. And we'll talk about, we can measure it, but it's not always viable. It's not very useful. And then it has to be consistent with a cognitive perspective, because SCCT is a cognitive-based theory coming out of attribution theory. Well, as we start going along, one of the things you have to keep in mind that when it's a crisis, that's actually kind of serious to start with. Because if you're in an organization, you don't use that term lightly. Because when you identify something as a crisis, that denotes resources and time going into that, and that's going to change your daily operations as you start focusing on the crisis, and you call together your crisis team, and you focus your energies on it. In January, I was part of this webinar, and it was mostly practitioners who were on this webinar, and they were taking us through this scenario and asking us, like, is it a crisis yet? And so there was like 3 steps, and by the second step, it was really bad. And probably all but 2 people thought it was a crisis by the second step. But even at the third step, there are still 2 people who are like, I don't want to call that a crisis. And so even among crisis managers, there's not always an agreement when it's bad enough. Some have a really high threshold. It's got to be really, really bad to be considered a crisis. And that's what creates problems when you're trying to assess extreme and severe, particularly when you think that's what crisis managers think, but what do people think? What do we think when we're affected by it? Because that really drives a lot of the crisis, what the stakeholders think. And so there was a question. I want to start off here. I'm going to ask you, how severe is it? All right? An explosion that destroys a facility, is that pretty severe? Yeah, that's severe. All right, well, let's say then there's an explosion in a facility and 25 people are injured. Is that severe? Yeah, all right. And then an explosion that destroys a facility with 3 fatalities. That's extreme. Now, if I ask you to rank order these, which one would be the least threatening? Yeah, the first one, all right? And as you can, it gets progressively worse. The problem is, unless you compare it, you're going to rate them all severe. If you were to get each of these individually and you weren't comparing them to one another, you get the first one, explosion of a facility. Wow, that's severe. Yeah, it is. It's a crisis. I mean, you've just destroyed a facility. And then you start adding in other things, injuries, fatalities. Yeah, that's all extreme. But the problem is, that's not how we experience crises. When you read about a crisis, you don't sit there and go, well, you know, I remember one that was a lot worse. And in fact, organizations sometimes say that. When the Valdez ran aground, Exxon famously said, you know, that's not even in the top 10 in terms of amount of oil leaked out. And the people in Valdez say, I don't care. I don't care what the top 10 list was. All I care about is right here. Even if it's a fairly small spill, you're impacted. You care about that, not where it ranks on some list. All right? So for you, that is severe. There was a case in Alabama where just in this small neighborhood, a pipeline ruptured, and just a handful of people on the street had to be evacuated. If you were to ask them, that was a severe crisis. All right? And that's what you get. So when you start asking people, and this is a pain scale, not a severity scale, but it's to kind of give you the idea. When you ask people, was that crisis severe? It all comes up here, all right? As a result, it's skewed. Everything is on the high end. You know, everything, like, it's an 8, it's a 9, it's a 10. Yeah, it's a crisis. So yeah, it's bad. And so when you ask just about severity, you can't get that fine gradation. Yet severity is kind of where you might start, because my research and research in marketing as well kind of comes out of attribution theory, and that's one of the dimensions you look at is severity. And none of that stuff really came out, because when you started asking people about severe, everything was severe and then not so. Of course, no crisis would not be severe, so it just makes sense, and that didn't work at all. All right, because yes, you could measure it, but it was not viable at all. It wasn't of any use. We tried doing that a couple of times, and after a while, it's like, yeah, let's move on. And some other people have looked at severity in other ways, some through susceptibility, and found a little bit, but still not very useful. Well, so I had to shift thinking and eventually came to cognitive appraisal theory. Cognitive appraisal theory matches the cognitive aspect that we're looking for. How do people look at situations? Now, the idea is that in each situation, you look for particular cues, and cues will stand out for you. Does that mean everyone will see these cues? No. Will everyone respond to those cues in the same way? No. But most people will see those cues, and most people will respond by having those cues produce particular emotions. And those emotions then will impact your behavior in some way. Again, it's not 100% correlation, because even some people who see the cues and the emotions may not have the behavior. But this is social science. We deal in kind of probabilities and what is more probable than the other. And the probability is if there are certain cues, they'll lead to emotions and result in particular behaviors. And so the idea is that these emotions come from the evaluations of the events. And that's what we see in crises. Not just the victims, but the people watching it. The rest of us look at that situation and we're making determinations about it. We're looking at the cues and thinking, part of those cues are, who's responsible for this? This seems like the organization could have done better or should have done more with that. And these are motivational. They trigger actions in you. And I want to specifically then move to one example that's been looked at quite a bit in organizations, and that's anger. Anger is commonly generated by crises. People get mad. They don't like what had happened. And not just the victims, but the people watching what has happened to the victims. They get very angry about what they're seeing. So the anger cues are another person is responsible for the negative event. In this case, the organization is responsible. They are responsible for what happened, so I need to hold them accountable. Then yourself or someone you care for has been injured or offended. And so you might be a victim, but even if you don't know people, when you see the victims on television or you see the victims on a video online, you have an empathy for them. And that's where this anger comes from. And that's what drives the anger. And it's been shown in a number of studies that this anger then drives people to make negative comments online. It drives people to not purchase the product again. So that's going back to, all right, there needs to be some kind of action coming out of it. Well, there is. People are taking actions about it. They are trying to change the situation. They're not going to buy that product anymore. And they are going to act against the organization. They're going to say bad things about the organization because they're upset about what has happened with the organization. I'll give you an example. It's a crisis more on the minor side of life. But in the United States, we've had this huge crisis in baseball because it's been revealed that one team that won the World Series in 2017 cheated. And so there's a lot of action being taken against that team by the league, but also now it's being taken out as baseball season started that players on that team are being hit by pitchers, right? Because other players are mad. So how can you get back? Well, throw it on, hit you with a ball, right? So they're taking action against it. This is all anger. It's being motivated. And as we'll see, that in the case of the Astros, it might even be even more than anger. And that's kind of what we need to do, is that anger is not enough to establish something as extreme. Because anger is going to be, every crisis situation is going to produce anger. You're going to be mad. Whether you had a cruise ship with a problem, or it was the release of a toxic chemical, you're going to be mad. Well, we need to take it up to a different level, and that's moral outrage. Moral outrage is an emotion that in the literature, they debated for a number of years whether or not it existed. People said, yes, there is moral outrage. People are like, oh, can you find me moral outrage? It's like, so eventually these two researchers did. They were able to find and prove moral outrage. And moral outrage, the cues are there's injustice been done, and the injustice is very much, they use the term greed, but exploitation might be a better general term for it. So those are the two factors. They look at it and say, oh, not only did they take advantage of people, but they did it just to make money. This is very exploitative. And that's what creates what they can identify as moral outrage. And not all crises are going to have these. A lot of crises don't have this moral outrage component. That in most cases, if you have, say, for instance, a train derailment, it's not going to come to the level of moral outrage in most cases, unless there's some other factors going on in that. a lot of the more common crises such as recalls and that, it's not going to have that outrage factor. That's going to be more rare. But it's still important to think about. Because what we're finding is that by accident, that moral outrage is actually a boundary condition for situational crisis communication theory. That once you reach kind of a certain threshold in moral outrage, the advice doesn't work anymore. You're in a different environment. You're in an extreme environment, and it's different now. And so we have to start thinking about things differently. And this all came about because we were looking at sort of this new idea of a type of crisis and how it might work out. And that is the scansis. Excuse me. And the scansis, by its name, it's a fusion of crisis and scandal. And what happens is, when you read about scandals, when you read about crisis, people oftentimes use the term as the same. Oh, it's a scandal, it's a crisis. But they're different. Because scandals, with scandal comes a moral component to it. And that's what brings the moral outrage to it, not the crisis, it's the scandal. So we created the term to denote, we're talking about a very specific situation here. Because if you just use the term scandal, well, that's a problem because scandal is used very differently in the literatures out there. If you're in finance, for instance, a scandal tends to be more sort of like embezzlement. And so you automatically, oh, that's embezzlement, that's a scandal. Well, a scandal isn't. A scandal is socially constructed. People need to see the moral component and feel the moral outrage from it. So there are times you could have something that looks a lot like a scansis, but for one reason or another, the moral outrage doesn't come out. And that's oftentimes a result of it doesn't get as much attention, or people are just burned out. There have been so many cases, by the time you get to the third one, like, oh, you know, we're tired of it. Back in the 90s, when we had a lot of corporate scandals of executives doing terrible things and companies stealing money and other stuff, by the time you got down the line, like to a company like Adelphi, it's like, oh, you know, yeah, that's another one. But if you're one of the first ones, like Enron, wow, that's the real moral outrage. And it's the transmogrification of a crisis. And transmogrification is to take something and to change it into a more negative idea. And that's what the scandal component does. It takes the crisis and changes it. And it infuses it with that idea of the moral outrage. And so we were playing around with this idea of scansis. And here are some examples of them. Wells Fargo had this nice system where they opened accounts in your name. It didn't tell you and charged you, but it was such a small amount you didn't notice it. But when you do that millions and millions of times, you make a lot of money. And when that gets revealed, people are really unhappy. Mylan Pharmaceuticals, makers of EpiPen. One day they decided to quadruple the price of the EpiPen. And if you have certain allergies, you really depend upon EpiPen. A lot of children need that. It's life-saving. And suddenly you might be pricing people out of the market for it. That was a scansis. Again, each of these, the underlying greed. Why are they opening accounts in your name? To make money. Why are they upping the price? To make money. The price of making it had not changed at all. Sears had a situation quite a long time ago when Sears used to be something. And they had these automotive centers, and you'd go into the automotive center and they'd tell you, oh, hey, you need a new brake jar. I'm like, oh, okay, and they'd repair your brakes. And they investigated and found out that oftentimes you were being charged for repairs you didn't need. Again, greed. That's a scansis that's out there. And so scansis, while they aren't highly common, they're not unknown. You're going to run into a few of these each year, but we'll see that's part of it. That's what kind of led us in this direction, because what we were doing is we were running some experiments with scansis. We're like, okay, yeah, we'll run these scansis and we'll use these responses and we'll see how it works out. And it didn't work out, all right, is what we got. So you set up the time, you do the studies, and you find out that the recommended response had no effect on the typical outcome variables, which are your post-crisis reputation. No effect. Purchase intentions, no effect. Negative word of mouth, no effect. It didn't work at all. So we're sitting there going, well, that's kind of unfortunate. You know, what are we going to do with this? All right, it's not working. We're like, something else is going on here. And this is when we first started thinking about the boundary conditions. And it's not that we didn't know there were boundary conditions, because I've always hated when I'd read someone who would write and they would say, if only they had apologized, everything would have been okay. And I'm sitting there going, no, it wouldn't. You know? And then I read a piece that was written about the Catholic Church in the U.S. And they were talking, and they didn't go that route. They didn't go, oh, if they had just apologized. They said, you know, at times you just got to embrace the pain. And the church needs to embrace the pain and kind of move forward through this. And that's a more sensible way to think about it. There are times when it's not going to help. You know, the apology is not going to help. But there could be other things we might do communicatively that could help. And so we were trying to explore some of that. And so what we wanted to do is to be more precise about what types of crises do most people perceive as extreme. It was like scansis, yeah, so scansis made sense because we had found this new type and it was a lot, we thought it was bad and it turns out it was a lot worse than we even thought it was. So okay, well let's look at this more carefully because scansis is similar, if you look at it in terms of attributions, to these two other types of crises that have already been identified. Management misconduct and human error. And these had typically been grouped together in what was called the preventable crisis cluster in SCCT. Because what you find is that you have very similar sort of perceptions of crisis responsibilities for these crises. But when you look at them, even on face value, it's like, yeah, they might be similar, but they're also different. And particularly human error and management misconduct, it had always sort of been odd to me that those two were together because they were different, but we hadn't found a way to really show their differences. And that's when moral outrage came in because it's like, all right, well, let's compare these three because these are the most likely candidates for an extreme crisis because these are the ones where when people look at them and say, yeah, high responsibility, because that's going to start moving you in that direction. Because there's going to be the responsibility, there needs to be responsibility as part of that, and that's going to kind of drive towards the injustice part of it. So what you find is that there are three distinct sub-crises using moral outrage. And that's how they separate it out. And those three, very different in terms of moral outrage. Human error, not that much outrage. Management misconduct, yeah, now you're starting to feel the outrage. And the scansis, you're really getting the outrage on it. So it's like, all right, it's somewhere in there. The boundary's going to fall somewhere within this crisis cluster that we have there. So what we're saying is that there's this triadic appraisal going on. And prior in SCCT, we had only been using a two-step process, and that was situation is negative, I'm in a crisis. People agree a crisis is negative. I mean, yeah, you might be able to turn it into a positive, but no company says, yeah, I'd like to have a crisis tomorrow. I think that would be a good thing. And no stakeholder thinks, oh, hey, yeah, I want to be really inconvenienced and have to take my car in for repairs. Like, no, you don't. It's negative. And you assign responsibility. That's natural. That's what we do. That's what attribution theory tells us from Weinersberg. We want to assign responsibility for this. Are we correct? Maybe, maybe not, but we're going to assign responsibility for this. And then we're going to add in the moral outrage as an additional component. So that's kind of moving it on from what we had done with SCCT. So like, yeah, this moral outrage, this is new, and this is kind of where that's going to help us find the boundary lines for all this, when these things work, and when it's really extreme or not. And this is where the line fell. Human error, that was kind of okay. It fit within SCCT's parameters and theories. But once you got to management misconduct and scansis, now we're out. Now we're in the extreme categories. And now you throw in management misconduct, you are looking at really a lot of crises each year. The Crisis Management Institute in the U.S. for over a decade now tracks media coverage of crises. And by far, the largest percentage of media coverage goes to management misconduct. And we'll see why that becomes so important in just a minute. So that's not to say that management misconduct is the most frequent type of crisis, but it gets the most media attention. But what that's telling you is, yeah, we should be paying attention to these. These are out there. We're going to need to deal with these. Because if we don't deal with them properly, and right now our guidance is not really optimal for them, what can we do about that? Well, the optimal response, again, only had an effect in the human error crisis for the product harm and industrial accidents. So if it was caused by human error, an example of this is there are quite a few recalls every month because there's an allergy that's not labeled on a product. Most of that, according to the food industry, is human error. Someone made a mistake when they were inputting stuff into the machine for the labels, and so it went through. So those are mostly human error in cause. And that's actually a pretty big percent of the recalls that are out there, the ones that are dangerous. Well, yeah, the advice will work in that situation, but when we get further with some of this management misconduct stuff, we're going to run into some problems. The risk is that people assume a suboptimal response is fine. So if you tell people that an optimal response doesn't help you, so they're thinking like, all right, we can lowball them then, all right? And that's like telling people, well, if you offer them $1,000, they're not going to take it. Like, well, then I'll just offer them 10. It doesn't matter, right? We can do anything we want. It's wide open. Well, that would be fine if this wasn't happening in isolation, but there's a risk of what's called infamy with a suboptimal strategy. And infamy is a particular type of social evaluation. And in infamy, it's a form of social disapproval. We usually think of social evaluations as, and I'll contrast it in a moment to reputation as an illustration of that. That's a social approval. Yeah, our reputation is good. People like us. There's a high level of attention from constituents, and that's why the media coverage matters. If management misconduct drives a lot of media coverage, that means your constituents know about it. And as a result, you could lead to infamy. And it generates negative emotional responses. People are unhappy. And again, it's kind of consistent with that notion of talking about moral or outrage. We are not happy with what they did. People were very upset, again, with Mylan. They're very upset with Wells Fargo. And that was only one of the things that Wells Fargo did. They did another thing with making people buy car insurance they didn't need to, because they were getting a kickback from a car insurance company they were making people go and get car insurance from. Yet you're our friends at Wells Fargo doing more work. So here's an example, because this is social evaluations. And social evaluations are our perceptions of organizations. So it comes from the stakeholders, not the organization. And infamy is very immediate. We have immediate response. Reputation, though, is over time. Because reputations are constructed over time. You interact with an organization, and so you have, if you use the same car manufacturer or you use like the same sort of cell phone provider, you kind of have a different reputation over time. Infamy is very effective. It's a lot about emotions, whereas reputation is more rational. You're kind of looking through it and making some assessments of it. And you can make some arguments about that, but these are kind of the distinctions that are being made by the people in management working with these concepts. So yeah, infamy, that's a real risk, and you don't want to be an infamous organization. Infamy is not a good thing. Right? You're well known, but you're well known for not being good. And so it all comes back to value incongruence, because what happens is, this is ideally what you have with an organization. You want some overlap between the organizational identity and your own. That's what breeds a strong relationship with stakeholders. And that's what a lot of communication, one way or another, is about between an organization and its stakeholders. Like, all right, I want to show you that we're similar to one another. Right? We have this. Well, what happens is, when you have these extreme crises, that starts to shatter. You get disidentification, and you move away. Because people look at that and say, whoa, that's not who I am. I mean, if you are a Wells Fargo customer, you got to be saying, like, that's not who I am. I'm not a cheating, lying scam artist, right? Or if you're Mylan, I'm not in it. I don't want to kill children because they can't afford medication. So they're not like you anymore. And if I don't do anything to address that problem, it can linger. And what they've been finding in the infamy literature is infamy tends to be self-generating. That once you start going in the direction of being infamous, it's not like people forget over time. They actually kind of hang on to that. And so if you, in your crisis response, don't address that and try and repair it, it can move you towards infamy, which long-term will damage your organization as you have disidentification and your stakeholders leaving. So when people would say it doesn't matter, the answer is no, it does matter, because you don't want to go become infamous. So what are the extremozymes that then allow organizations to survive in these extreme crisis situations? Recognize the moral violation. That's the key. Apologies don't always do this. There's nothing in an apology that says, I have to recognize what I did to you. It's just like, oh, I'm sorry that happened. And you have these other criteria. I mean, there are entire books writing about how to apologize. You can go online and look up like recipes for apologies. And then you get the non-apologies apologies, which is what the Houston Astros did. They gave the non-apology apology. Like, oh, we're sorry for our fans that we cheated. And like, that's not who's upset. The fans don't care how you got the title. What's upset are the teams that lost to you. Those are the ones who are mad. And their fans are mad. And they're mad because of what you did. And you're not, there's no accountability for that. They ask us. So in the experiments, when you have you give them a good response where they're doing some curative actions, they're apologizing, then you compare that by doing those same responses and you layer in recognizing moral violations. Now that moves people. That makes them change. But it doesn't move you on the old traditional outcomes we've looked at for crises. That doesn't impact reputation, doesn't impact purchase intention, doesn't impact negative word of mouth. What it does impact is value congruence. And that's what you're worried about. If you go back here with slides, we're getting incongruent. We need to kind of move back to this state. This response helps to move you back towards that state. You start seeing that pretty quickly. So even though I don't impact reputation, I can impact value congruence, and that's really what I'm concerned about here. And that kind of led us to look at some of these new variables with it. So you still need to be accommodated. You still need to focus on the victim. So you still need to go through the old optimal advice, but you got to hold itself accountable. And the key is the state that you know what you did wrong. You know the moral violation. You don't say, I'm sorry you're upset. You say, you're going to say, I understand that you're upset because we raised prices, which meant price people out of the market. We charged you when we shouldn't have. We exploited you in some way. People want to hear that. They want to hear that recognition. Because that shows if you understand what you did wrong, then when you say, okay, I'm going to fix this, the curative, I can better believe that and I can start seeing the value congruence. Otherwise, I don't know what you're going to fix because I don't know that you know what you did wrong. Right? Because Wells Fargo is talking about, we're going to implement all these new procedures and these policies. Well, just how about addressing fundamentally what you did wrong to people and how you wronged them? And so that's the extremozyme, is acknowledging the moral violation. And that's currently what we're exploring. The data is coming out pretty good for it, that seems to work. It helps to kind of bring people back and can move value congruence. And as you can see from a time when people experience the crisis, and then a response with the moral one will kind of move them towards value congruence, which is very promising. Because it's also, in a way, it doesn't just reduce value incongruence, but it also helps to create perceptions of empathy, that you have empathy for the stakeholders through this. And both of those serve to move an organization away from infamy. Because if you think, okay, yeah, they seem to be understanding what they did wrong, they are empathetic towards my needs, that can help kind of move towards that idea of maybe you're not as bad as I think you are. So kind of moving away from infamy. And so the lessons from the extremophiles are that moral outrage is one of the creators of extreme crises. There can be more. Also looking at some data when racial issues come into play, and racism is a part of that, and that could also kind of really heighten the situation for an organization. We've revised crisis responses to recognize moral violations. It's kind of a new response and also a new outcome. And consider the outcome measures more with value congruence. We hadn't really, that had kind of been a part of it, but sort of in the distance about identification with an organization, but this looks at it more specifically. But with this, I'd like to end with just the one risk. And this was the risk that was pointed out. Someone's like, well, what if an organization purposefully creates a scansus to boost profits? Like, all right, I'm going to do this. I found a nice way. I can cheat my customers. I know I'm going to get caught, but when I get caught, I'll just engage in this nice type of response, and I'll use these ideas to fix the problems that they create with the scansus. That is a possibility. That's always a risk. I would argue that this isn't something you could do all the time. Maybe you could get away with it once, but I doubt it's going to work twice, because then it's a pattern and then it's different when it's a pattern to what's going on. And that would suggest some really bad decision making by your management team, because oftentimes, take Wells Fargo for instance. Wells Fargo, it wasn't sort of like this evil, nefarious plot. It just kind of happened because of systems they had set up within the organization. Mylan was more purposeful in their choices in terms of what they are. But that could happen, and that's a risk. Hopefully that's not what people take away from this. But that's why you always have to contextualize your research. Why we were concerned that when our first study, when we found, oh, there's no effect for an optimal strategy, the people would assume, well, then I can say anything. Like, no. We want to look at, there are some downsides to it. And so there's probably some downsides to this as well. But what it really got at when we started looking at those three types of crises, when we had human error, management misconduct, and sciences, is that boundary made a lot of sense, because that boundary line actually was intentionality. In human error, in most cases, your employee didn't mean to do the mislabel. Yeah, occasionally there's sabotage, but that's not the case here. People make mistakes, and we know that. We still hold the organization accountable. They're responsible, but it's not as big of a deal because there's a lack of intentionality. When management engages in misconduct, when they've discriminated, when they've engaged in sexual harassment, when they've engaged in bribery, that's intentional. Those were choices they made to do that. And same thing with sciences. You were making choices to go in that direction to make it that bad. You knew that what you were doing was going to be an injustice to your stakeholders, and you knew you were doing it just to make more money. There was a case in the United States with the Peanut Corporation of America where they knowingly sent out salmonella-tainted peanut butter paste, which actually resulted in the deaths of individuals from that. That was a knowing choice made. Why did they make it? Because if they didn't ship, they would lose money. And sometimes the profit motive pushes them forward, and that's a sciences as well. So that's sort of what we've been looking at and trying to understand, that when does an organization get into an extreme crisis? We think we have a better handle on kind of beginning to understand when a crisis is extreme. As I said, there might be other factors that do that. And we also I think we have a good handle on how to respond to that when you're in those situations, and trying to explore those upper ends of the negative crisis situation, and kind of seeing how we've moved from tardigrades to understanding kind of the extreme environments for the organizations. And we want to kind of further explore those to try and understand them, because the final point to remember is that even though they're not the most common form of crisis, they're frequent enough to warrant our attention and to worry about as an organization, that someday you might be in a situation where your organization is confronted with one of those extreme crises. And with that, I'll open it up to questions. Yes?
Yeah, I have a question. So, first of all, thank you for the speech. I can do that again. Okay. So I think the line you drew with injustice and greed makes total sense, because often we see relationships between corporation and people as interpersonal relationships.
Right.
And it's a seen as like a break of trust, break of respect for the customer, and it's feeling like you end up feeling like you've been taken advantage of.
Yes.
Right? And when this moral outrage is present in interpersonal relationships, we see shoes flying, appliances flying, and like people don't answer your calls and like all of that stuff. But like when you're talking about the corporate scenario, how does that moral outrage expresses itself in a measurable way that we can identify and say, okay, it's a sciences, this is what you got to do?
Part of it's going to be in kind of how they then talk about you. And nowadays that tends to be mostly in the social media, and you'll see that appearing. And in fact, there's a concept, and it's something we need to look at in the future related to this, about moral language, and that you might find that moral language creeping into the comments that are being made. So it's not that I'm just angry at you. So a lot of times all you kind of look at sentiment analysis, positive, negative. Well, that negative could be negative in a lot of different ways, and trying to understand that negative, I think you're going to see, is different in moral outrage versus I'm just mad at you and the moral outrage, there are going to be some components of that. Because I think what you're going to find is the comments referencing the moral violation, directly or indirectly in some way. That's what's really making people mad. And oftentimes companies, or customers or stakeholders, that's what they say. It's like, you don't understand what you did wrong, and they'll actually call them out on that. And so I think you're going to see that there. Your other risk is you're going to see that in purchase intention really taking a hit. But I mean but that gets masked because that's common in any type of crisis. But I think the most obvious one will be in how they talk about you. I think will be quantitatively or qualitatively different from when they're just angry, when there's been some kind of moral outrage.
Terms like evil and
yeah, I would bet if you got the data from social media, you would see not only a higher volume of comments in the scansis, but what's in the nature of those comments. There was a case a few years ago where a British utility company, they were British Gas, and they did this massive price raise. And it was at a time when their costs weren't escalating. And so they actually got investigated by the government over this. And the amount of visceral comments coming out on them online was massive. The funny part was they announced it the day they had set up an online sort of live tweet with their head of customer relations. I felt so bad for this guy because oh, we're jacking up your prices, and then here's this guy on Twitter and is like, and you know what's coming his way. I mean, all kinds of stuff. And these comments, I mean, it was really about like, you are now making people choose between heat and food, heat and medication. Do you not see what you've done wrong? And it was really a very different thing than just saying like, you're a terrible gas company. It's like, you're going to cause people to die. And I'm talking about like, are people going to just like burn their furniture? I mean, what are they going to do in response to that? So you saw, I mean, it was massive and immediate. So I think that's one of the differences that you could actually map out very easily, I think.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, first of all, thank you for speaking. So you talked a lot about organizations, and it just got me thinking, how can we apply this to like individuals such as politicians or celebrities or like now famous YouTubers or bloggers? So how can we apply this theory to them when it comes to issues of racial injustice or sexual harassment? And do you think we should allow them to thrive in situations of scansis?
That's a good point. Sometimes people should just be punished for it. But if it's, sometimes people do it inadvertently, they don't know it. But I think probably one of the problems has been is that they don't go back and they don't address the why part of it. Kind of go back here with this, is I don't think they want to explain their moral violations part of it. If you think back to when one of the Jenners was doing the Pepsi ad, and it received a very negative response to it. So they pulled the ad, and Pepsi just moved on. Well, there was no sort of acknowledgement of why people were so mad about it. And I think you need to start addressing that instead of just saying like, oh, we didn't mean to offend anyone. No, you did. And you need to understand why, and you need to express why you understand or why it was offensive. And I think that's what a lot of influencers run into is, they're influencers. It's not like they were trained in it, right? And as a result, they're going to make mistakes in terms of how they communicate and how they frame things. And they need to show to their audience, they understand what they did was wrong in some ways. Because a lot of times they'll do something like, or they'll wear particular clothing or do their hair in a particular way and be called for cultural appropriation. Well, they need to show that they understand why they didn't know it was wrong. Now they do know it was wrong, kind of how they've learned from that. I think that's what they need to be doing. I think it can be done on that level. Politicians are they're just a whole. I always think back of Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton never took responsibility for anything and doesn't even know what he did was wrong. But I think for the influence, I think would fall under a similar category system.
What do organizations and people do in cases where they're actually not wrong, the public's wrong?
That's the hardest one. is you need to find a way to convince them that they're wrong, but you have to do it nicely. All right, this is where companies make mistakes. There's a strategy, and this goes back. There's this typology of how to explain things to people, and one of them is how do you explain to someone what they believe is wrong. And what you do is you start by saying, it's logical that you might think this. However, in reality, and then you kind of lay out what the case is. And that's what you kind of, and as an organization, that's tough to start with, like, I understand why you think that, but when you say that, you reinforce it for them, right? You say, but this is why it's not wrong, and present the evidence. Will that correct it? Research says sometimes yes, sometimes no, because you got a real problem with people kind of believing.
Can I follow up on that?
Yeah.
There was an article I read recently that showed that they did studies basically that apologizing doesn't work in a lot of cases.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, it causes it to get worse because now you've shown that you are guilty in their minds.
Right, yeah.
And so they will attack you more for it. How do you say in this situation that you would deal with that? Because apology doesn't work. And so I would assume that recognizing the moral issue or whatever just causes them to become more angry. Wouldn't it have the opposite effect?
I think they're working on two different dynamics there. Because with the apology acknowledges that you are responsible, right? So you're accepting responsibility, and that's why, if you look at the data in the corporate world, the data they tend to track are reputation and stock prices. That right after you apologize, you're going to see both go down a little bit more, but then they start going up. And if you compare their upward trajectory to organizations that don't apologize, their upward trajectory is faster and quicker. The other one's a slow climb. You'll come back pretty quick. So you're going to take that immediate hit. But the moral component of it, I think, is something that people want to see. They want you to understand why they want you to recognize why you did what you did was wrong. And I think that's the different dynamic there. And you see that sometimes in comments where people are like, oh, you finally were willing to admit that you did this. And that's part of what they want them to own up if they're going to say they're going to fix it. So I think that's why it's a little bit different dynamic from the apology, that it's going to help move you in a direction that you need to go in. It's not always going to work, and not for all people. Because, again, some people it's just going to reinforce into them that you're just a really bad company for it. But for those who are willing to kind of mend that relationship, that's what's going to move it towards. Because, yeah, you're going to get some people that once you've done that, it's over. And no matter what you say is going to matter. But others, the ones you can salvage, I think, will come out.
Thank you.
Hi, Dr. Coombs. Thank you again for your talk. I was thinking about your depiction of extremophiles, and I was thinking about some of these groups based on, issue X that become so insular, and their behavior is self-reinforcing, and they don't seem to be responsive in some ways to moral outrage, or they, are sort of a self-fulfilling organism on its own. And what would you say are the extremozymes that would best respond to those, not only in the political realm, but in I think in the social engineering realm as well?
Yeah, sometimes you're going to run into the situation where communication doesn't work. And that's, we like to think that it will always fix things, but you're right. Sometimes if you've decided that this circle's over here and this circle's over here and they're never going to come together, yeah, it's
that value in congruence.
Yeah, and it's just going to, it just reinforces those views. That's really challenging, because what that demands is that people who are being insular not be insular and actually start accepting and looking at other views, and that doesn't happen with a lot of those groups. And so sometimes they're separate and they're just separate. It's like when I tell my students, like, this is a very simple way to view your stakeholders, but there are those who love you, those who hate you, and those who aren't sure. Well, you want to reinforce the ones that love you. You're going to target the ones who aren't sure, and just don't worry about the ones who hate you, because they're probably going to hate you anyway. And I think that's what you're running into with these groups. And a lot of the stuff is trying to be done through mediation and other types of work. And like there's even been kind of like mapping showing, oh, but you think you disagree, but you agree on these points, and you show it to them, and they're like, no, that's not how it is. And some groups just want to be in conflict, and that's kind of what's at their core, and they're just going to stay with it. And I think that's what a lot of times like with organizations and some activist groups, we can't bridge that. There's just going to be this tension that exists between them. And it's how do you manage that tension?
I've been a part of a lot of electoral campaigns, and we always say that those who hate us have as much to teach as those who love us, if not more, because we can separate them from our data analysis.
Yeah, and that's why I think organizations often undervalue negative feedback. When it's funny, prior to the rise of the digital channels, organizations were always interested in negative feedback from customers. But now when it's visible to everyone else, well, then they're not quite as thrilled about it. But there's still a lot to be learned from that, and to try and understand what you did and why what you did was wrong. Or what you can do is you can inadvertently tap into anger you didn't know exists, but you need to fix. And I'll give you an example of a company that this was a very early use, before they even used the term social media. Shell Oil had a situation a couple decades back where they had some really bad, they're involved in probably somehow related to genocide in Nigeria, and also the Brett Spar oil buoy situation, which kind of really, with activist groups, it really blew up. And after that, Shell actually has had a history of being really good communicatively. And after that, Shell's communication people are saying like, how did we miss this? How do we miss these two things? And so what they did is in the early days of the internet, they went out and they created discussion boards that anyone could post to. It was called Tell Shell. And they told people just don't use profanity, but people ignored that, but they didn't edit it. I mean, you wouldn't want a child reading these posts. This was with the anger coming out. And what they did is they read through all of those to understand where the anger was coming from, and to then start addressing that in their communication campaigns, saying like, we've missed the boat. We don't know, somehow we have lost touch with you. And then they went back. And I mean, I remember reading, I mean, if you want to talk about a painful experience, you're talking like, it's not like, do you hate me or not? It's like, how much do you hate me is essentially what they're doing. And that's what they were starting to get from all this. And it really did have them reformulate their communication strategies and even some of their corporate strategies they were doing. It's like, well, we can't do this, and look where this is going. We've got to be able to change this in some way. And that's why I think there's often a failure to kind of embrace that negative side. That they knew they weren't going to win some of these people over, but they're like, well, if we keep going in that direction, eventually some of the people who like us and those who aren't sure are going to join the other side. So we've got to kind of address those concerns.
Hi, just going off, thank you for the talk. It was actually quite nice. Just going off what he said, actually. The case of Crab Pack Chowdhury down in Vancouver. There was a rumor that went around that there were rats in their bowl, and that was actually not true. And perception is reality. Mm-hmm. What people think might form the reality of an organization. In a case of that's actually not true. What can an organization do to actually change it? Because it was actually a rumor that started, which turned into a reality for some people, and that caused the organization to actually shut down, even after the CEO released the video showing the day-to-day process of the organization, that it's impossible for the rat to actually get into the bowl, but people still found it hard to believe. And the fact that it started out as a rumor and led to the organization to shut down, that is actually a powerful crisis right there. It started off like as an issue, but turned out into like a smothering crisis that the organization couldn't get over. What can you do in such a situation?
There are kind of two views on that, and and they still exist today, oddly enough. But when rumors first came out, you have two options. One, sometimes companies say, we're just going to ignore it and it'll go away. That's really kind of problematic. The other one is you got to go at it directly, and you got to go at it fast. Because if you don't, address it fast, it's going to overwhelm you, and then it might become the reality. And sometimes that happens, even when companies are very aggressive in going after it. A case where it worked, Pepsi had a case years and years ago where they thought there was a syringe in a Pepsi can. And Pepsi was able to prove that that was impossible. There was no way for it to happen. And it turned out later that it wasn't, that the household where they had found the syringe in the can is someone was a diabetic and had put the syringe in the can so that it wouldn't puncture the trash bag, and then someone else found the can and thought the syringe, they had opened it, but it was a weird situation. But what they did is they showed a video of how their production line goes and how it was impossible for that to happen, and they aggressively fought that, and they won. But that doesn't always win. Because another case is Procter & Gamble, for over 100 years, used what was called the Man in the Moon logo. And it was like a quarter of a moon shape with some stars. And the rumor started to circulate, and this was pre-internet, that the founder of Procter & Gamble had sold his soul to the devil so that P&G would be successful. And people claim that the current CEO, who was a descendant, had been on Oprah and had said this publicly. And so this started to circulate online, and Procter & Gamble fought it and fought it and fought it, and very aggressively fought it. And I remember seeing a presentation by them at a PR meeting where they said, well, we think we finally have this beaten. Well, 2 years later, the internet appears. And as the internet starts to spread, so does Man on the Moon, Satan, your Church of Satan. They still give profits to the Church of Satan. It overwhelmed them, and they removed the logo, which they had invested like over 100 years, and it was important to them. They finally moved it because they could not beat back that one. But another aggressive one that did work is Febreze. When it first came out, there was a rumor that Febreze could kill pets. Well, that was one of its main selling points, was pet odor. And so there was, on their website, they very aggressively fought that and had a lot of testimony. And this is where it's crucial when you're fighting rumor to get third-party support. And they brought in veterinary associations to say, no, there's no risk to your cat or your dog. Now, some birds maybe, but not cats and dogs, and to really kind of aggressively fight this. At one point in time, I don't think they have it anymore, Starbucks used to have a site on its website where they would fight rumors. The rumors that would come up. I don't think they've done this lately, but I guess they went through a period of time where they had a lot of rumors. And one of them was that they weren't supporting the troops. And this was during which of our many conflicts? I think it was Bush II, and kind of when we go and we decided we were going to be all over the Middle East. And they were saying they didn't support the troops because they wouldn't let coffee be sent to the troops. And it all came from one former military man who had heard from a friend that they couldn't ship the Starbucks coffee, or Starbucks wouldn't ship the coffee. And Starbucks actually had to work with him to explain this, that no, it was governmental rules that precluded them from doing what he said. He said, oh, they should do X. And they're like, no, you can't, the government won't let us do that. If we want to, this is how we have to send it if we want to send it. So that's why that wasn't done. And then that man then retracted it, and that helped to knock it back because he was a source and it helped to retract it. Procter & Gamble did a similar thing when a group was arguing that their new Pampers were causing chemical burns on children. And what they did is they brought in 3 very prominent mommy bloggers. And if you're not familiar with mommy bloggers are very powerful because young women with children, I think of my nieces, they looked online for support, and so they go to these groups. And they kind of ran them through in this 2-day session where they explained to them what really was going on, that yes, that there are some children who will have an allergic reaction to those diapers and don't use them anymore. Use Clyde, use whatever, but don't use our product anymore if it's a problem. And they were able to help them combat it. And so you need to have that third-party support in those ways. But it has to be fast, and you have to have that type of support for it to have any chance to win. But there's no guarantee that you will, because as you rightly point out, perception is what matters, and perception can overwhelm online. I mean, because we have, like I said, the issue with Procter & Gamble, but also in the United States, we had the problem with the anti-vaxxers and kind of putting all this stuff online about you give your vaccine to your kids, it's going to give them epilepsy, and which is blatantly untrue and creates a problem because then, for instance, my niece, my great nephew, he's a little over a year old. she couldn't come back from Christmas one year. She couldn't fly back because he was too young to be immunized, and the measles were having an outbreak because so many people had stopped immunizing their children. We've lost the herd protection. That her pediatrician said, don't fly. The risk is too great to the child because other people aren't vaccinating and measles is allowed to spread. So it gets tough. The best advice is get out there fast, get some third-party support. That's your best shot.
Thank you. I think we'll have to stop there because we're at time. And I just want to say again, thanks to Dr. Coombs for coming.